Trigger warning. This podcast episode features discussions of emotional abuse and toxic workplaces. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Sarene Leeds. I'm a professional writer and storyteller, and I'm so glad you're here. The podcast's Toxic Workplace series is still going strong with today's guest, Kara Kushnir. Kara is a licensed clinical social worker and the founder of a Work of Heart counseling in New Jersey. She is also a toxic workplace survivor. As always, before we get into the episode, I have a few quick announcements. Please make sure you're following me on Instagram at Sarene Leeds Writes. That's SareneLeedsWrites. And that you're also subscribed to this podcast on either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Yes, you heard that correctly. Emotional Abuse is Real is now available on YouTube. The link to my YouTube channel is available in the show notes. Also, don't forget to support Emotional Abuse is Real by leaving a 5-star rating and by writing a review over on Apple Podcasts. Another way to connect with me and this podcast is through my email list, which you can subscribe to by downloading my free resource, 10 Things I Learned from Getting Paid to Watch TV. This download is a collection of some of my best writing tips and tricks, all of which I learned from covering television. And if you're a small business owner looking for help with some of your business copy, I highly recommend that you grab that free download. Finally, if you're interested in being a guest on Emotional Abuse is Real, you can always either DM me on Instagram, email me at hello@SareneLeedsWrites.com, or you can fill out my quick and simple application form. I've left links to my Instagram, email, the show's application form, and my free download in the show notes. Although I'll be covering toxic workplaces for the next month or so, this podcast, at its core, will always be a safe space to discuss any form of emotional abuse. On today's episode, Kara Kushnir and I discuss how her experience in a toxic workplace led her to open her own thriving practice, and how, as a clinician, she is seeing several clients come to her with mental health issues relating to toxic workplaces. I absolutely loved talking with Kara, and I hope you get as much out of our chat as I did. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Kara Kushnir.
My name's Kara Kushnir. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a perinatal mental health certified clinician. I work with children, adolescents, and women all across New Jersey, as well as in Pennsylvania, Florida, and South Carolina via telehealth. And I am the owner and founder of a private practice called A Work of Heart Counseling.
Wonderful. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. So to kick things off, I would love to hear your own toxic workplace story.
Sure. It's funny because my practice really started because of, I think, what was a toxic workplace environment that we wouldn't expect. And I don't think that a lot of the times toxic workplaces are, it's not intentional, but they happen more often than people think. So I was actually working in a school system, and I experience that quite often, that a lot of people working in public sectors experience a lot of toxicity in their work environment. And I was pregnant at the time. It was during the pandemic, and I was having so many medical issues. And I asked for accommodations. I had documentation. I was really just trying to figure out how to make it work. And it was just time after time, no, we're not going to accommodate you. We're not going to help you. And I kind of realized in that moment, it gave me an opportunity to reflect on so many times where my values did not align with what I was experiencing happen. And I also recognized that I didn't just as a person feel valued for what I was bringing to the table. So it really helped me recognize dysfunctional management, ways that people were just communicating with each other, things that were being said that were just so inappropriate. And as a clinician and at heart was able to recognize that, but even just as a person who'd experienced dysfunctional relationships or just inappropriate communication in terms of that professionalism, it made me go, this is not okay. So I ended up jumping ship 3 months into my pregnancy. I had no plan except for I have this part-time, very, very part-time private practice, and I'm going to make it work because I have to. And I think that it was kind of the right thing for me to do. Ultimately, trusting my gut really helped me. And it's something that I really try to drive home for the people that I serve now who also experience, whether it's toxic workplace environment or really just, toxic or really challenging dynamics in the workplace, particularly women and what they're experiencing in transitional periods of life. But I also really recognize just as people who are trauma survivors, people who have experienced dysfunctional relationships, they're more prone to also be in those situations, interestingly. And I've noticed that in my work. But it's been a huge shift for me to now do this. And I went from being one part-time therapist to now a group of 13 in less than 5 years. So it kind of goes to show you that when you listen to yourself and it's not the right place to be, good things can happen.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm sorry you went through that, but I love the ending of that story. And thank you so much for sharing that. It's what's so interesting about podcasting is that I end up sharing my story like almost every episode, but it's not because so much that I want to talk about myself. It's because I do want to commiserate. And like every new guest, I find like a different way of relating my own story to the guest. So anyone who's listened to my podcast is probably sick of hearing me talk about my toxic workplace situation at Rolling Stone. However, what I don't talk about as much is one of the many reasons why I left is because I knew there was no way I could ever be pregnant in that environment. Mm-hmm. I only knew in the 7 years that I was there of one person who was pregnant, and and the whole time she was there while pregnant was a fiasco. I knew that the long hours and the late nights would not be conducive to even getting pregnant, which is why I didn't even get pregnant until after I left. I'd like to just say, and I just knew that no one was going to accommodate me. So, and also on the subject of the schools, it's so interesting that you had that experience because I have a daughter in the elementary public school system. And she has ADHD, and we have not gotten an official diagnosis yet, but it's looking like she's on the autism spectrum. Mm-hmm. And there have been so many people who have been in her corner advocating for her. So wonderful. But when you get those few toxic people who are supposed to be helping her and they show zero empathy, which is what we have experienced. First of all, a couple of years ago, I wrote my master's thesis on poor communication in the public school system because we had a terrible school psychologist. Not the case anymore, just want to say. And then recently, in trying to get my daughter the supports that she needs, the chairperson of our special education committee, she's just there to do her job. There was no empathy there. So I'm just telling you all that to say, I hear you, I get you, and this is an underlying problem in any industry. Yeah. Unfortunately.
The toxicity is so impactful on women specifically, I think, in that sense. Yes. And to that point, I really appreciate you sharing that because I was on a child study team. Part of why I wanted to leave was because I went into working with children, and it was my start of my career, especially children with disabilities, as a sibling of somebody with a disability, as somebody who really wanted to make a difference. And I was finding myself at odds often with the administration, where it's all about the money and it's all about, what's like the bare minimum we can give, and sort of like really just these inappropriate conversations about parents. And I did not like that. I was like, I don't want to be on this side of the table anymore. I got to leave. And that's really why I love doing what I do now, because I get to go to the meeting with the parent, and that's much more what I want to do.
Oh, I am so happy to hear that that's what you do, because we need those advocates. And what you just described is what happened in our special education committee meeting a couple of weeks ago. The chairperson was trying to give the bare minimum. And this was someone who did not know us, who did not know my daughter. And I stopped her and I said, with all due respect, I want to hear the recommendations from my daughter's teacher and from her school psychologist. And they went in and they were like, no, what you, the chairperson, are recommending, it's not enough. And so between the three of us, we were able to get my daughter the supports that she needs. But it was really mind boggling that a person who it's her job to provide the services for children in need, was doing everything that she could to basically save the school money.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But so yeah, I totally get that. So moving on to your practice, what are you seeing from your clients when it comes to toxic workplaces? Meaning, what are the main things they're complaining about? What's hurting them the most? Where do they need the most help?
So it's interesting. A lot of the work that I do with my adult clients, whether they are in transition into parenthood or they're women and they're navigating different stages of life, when we talk about career and their experiences in the workforce, the themes I notice specifically often are sort of parallel to their own process in trying to heal trauma wounds. And it's interesting because they often find themselves in these power dynamics or struggles with superiors, especially, who mimic some of those dysfunctional relational patterns that they've experienced, because they're often people pleasers. My clients, they're people who are really good at heart and want to do the right thing. They're high achieving and perfectionists. They're anxious, like they don't want to mess up. And so they get taken advantage of, and they don't even recognize it right away. They start to recognize that they feel unheard. They feel misunderstood, undervalued. The biggest thing is just that being taken advantage of and sort of being like not wanting to say no. It's interesting. I was just talking with somebody recently who a new parent has a little one at home who's under a year old and it works in a school. So going back to that piece, and it's kind of like, I want to balance, how can I do what I want to do in my personal life and have that work-life balance. And it's so challenging. And that's a big theme that I hear. There's sort of hijacking of people as worker bees instead of actually looking at them as people, which really bothers me so much fundamentally. And I can talk about that later, why potentially, but it totally recognizes, or I said embodies, I should say, for me, watching it, this sense of, you don't matter. You're just here to do your job and do what I want you to do. And that makes people feel unvalued, unworthy, and it hits that wound that might already exist. So that's certainly something that I notice really a lot of. And then I also hear a lot of people talking about quiet quitting. There's like a lot of wanting to do that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that, actually, I have one more question before we get into that topic. So what are you as a therapist doing to help these people heal and, if necessary, extract themselves from the toxic work environment or just improve their situation?
Yeah. So a lot of it has to do with how do they, first of all, develop those effective communication skills? Like, what do they feel comfortable talking about? What do they feel comfortable pointing out in the room when it's the elephant in the room, and how do they do that effectively? That's a big piece of it. So, pulling from clinical modalities like DBT that really help people do that. A lot of folks were working on setting those boundaries and sort of reassessing their boundaries. They don't even recognize that they have shaky boundaries, that they're sort of, there's not a lot of clarity in place, and sort of how do you do that? And so can you reconsider, well, when are you coming in the morning and when are you leaving? And are you checking your emails when you're home? And what's the notification system like? And what, does your boss text you? And like, how do you deal with that? And sort of navigating those pieces, but it's also just helping them shift their expectations of themselves. I actually just recently shared a really awesome clip. It's of Shonda Rhimes she's doing a commencement speech at Dartmouth, and she's talking about and you might have seen it, where like women cannot have it all. She's like, you can't, like if you're killing it at work, you're probably missing something at home. And I use that example to say, like, you're not failing if you're not doing one over the other. It's okay though to choose you in salvation over this job, because one of the things I really embody with my clients and want them to embody is we work to live. We do not live to work. And people really struggle with that.
Yeah. It's hard because so many companies, they embrace the latter attitude.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I've been saying a lot recently how I personally can't work for a company anymore. I have to work for myself because there are too many things in my life that take precedence over devoting myself to a company. Also, fun fact about Shonda Rhimes. I once interviewed her and she was on the treadmill doing the interview.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was like, that is so cool. I wish I could do both things at once. That's amazing. You're awesome, Shonda. So, all right, going back to the quiet quitting, I would love to hear what you're seeing in that respect. And also, to use yourself as an example, do you find that toxic workplaces are driving more and more people into self-employment? I know it did me.
Yeah, I think in some ways, yes. It's funny. I think it's driving people either into self-employment and entrepreneurship, or it's driving them into really seeking out and really questioning when they're going for jobs, what is the culture? And that's a good thing.
Yes.
I think in the quiet quitting, I see it as sort of synonymous with being burned out. That's really what it is. And I think that people are just picking and choosing much more intuitively, and sometimes just out of necessity and survival. Like, I'm not doing this anymore. And sort of that checking out. That's really what it comes down to, is people are checking out. And it makes sense. I think that if you are in that state of being burned out, you are running on survival. So that's something we're talking about a lot. And then people feeling this ambivalence of, I don't want to lose my job because I need it right now while I figure this out, but I can't do this anymore. And sort of how do they live in that in between? That's something that comes up quite often. And it's funny because as someone who went into really self-employment, and now I have a practice where I employ other people, it was so critical to me that the culture and climate of this practice was, well, first of all, I have all women staffed, and I have a lot of moms on my staff, but we are very much about work-life balance. Like, it's so important. And like, and I constantly am doing things with them to talk about that, because I don't want them to feel burned out. Like, then they can't do good work. And it's sort of people, I think the problem in corporate America is it's so backwards. It's like, if you take care of the business side and make sure the bottom line is met, but if you take care of your people and if you're well cared for, you're going to do a good job. It's going to translate into the work. Like, it's not rocket science. It's right. If you have good relationships and take care of people, it comes back to you. And I feel like a lot of people are like, how did you do this so fast? I'm like, I don't know. I feel like that's the secret sauce, guys. Like, be a good human. Like, I don't know. So but it's really sad, because that's what people are experiencing quite often, is people who are so focused on the bottom line that it drives people to just be in existence in employment. And I think that's what quiet quitting really comes down to, is like, I want to get out of here. I don't know how do I just survive the bare minimum until I can find my way out? And it's so unfortunate, because that's no way to live.
No, it's not. And that, I mean, 10 years ago when I left Rolling Stone, there was no such, nobody knew the term quiet quitting didn't exist, but that is certainly what was happening to me. I meant to touch upon what you said about boundaries. There were many reasons why I had to just leave. There was no way of saving the situation, but my boss, because he was an older dude and he had no self-awareness, could not recognize that I was setting boundaries. He took offense that I started to set boundaries, because what was more important to him was fealty, stroking the ego, being his friend. He never could complain about my work, because I did a great job. He always complained that I didn't stroke his ego, that I wasn't friendly enough to him. And because I was putting up boundaries, because I was very uncomfortable. So that leads me to the question of how much of what's happening in these toxic workplaces is a generational thing. Because I think one of the reasons why it took me so long to leave is because I'm a baby Gen Xer Zennial. So I was raised to believe to accept, put your head down, figure out a way to make it work. And now that I'm an avid viewer of toxic workplace TikTok, I'm seeing younger generations saying, no, well, to use a Gen X phrase, we're not going to take it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so funny. I do think in part it is very generational. I mean, I'm on like a earlier millennial who was raised
Uh-huh.
by baby boomers, and I
Right.
definitely
I was
think
raised
that
by boomers. Yeah.
yeah, and I
Yeah.
definitely think that there are I do think that there's this mindset shift significantly. I think Gen X is where it started to improve. I feel like that's where it's really been the shift, and then it's continued on. And working with like young adults, like our Gen Zers are really all about it. But I
Yeah.
think that yes, it's a shift towards this sense, and I think that there's a lot of people are really the older generations are very negative about that because it's almost like suffering is equated with like goodness, and it's not true at all. There, it's your value is not equated to how hard you've had to grind and sacrifice yourself. But there is sort of this equation in their minds about that, and I think that makes sense. These got a lot of them raised by the greatest generation. You go
Yeah.
back to this idea of that World War II mentality and sort of like what people had to sacrifice, and it makes a lot of sense. But it is so generational, this shift. And I think that it's going to continue to probably evolve in that direction. But that's why I think we're noticing a lot of this come up in our culture right now. People talking about toxic workplace, people talking about work culture in general is because of that shift in the workforce. And you're seeing this divide. And so as I'm experiencing it with my clients, primarily who are Gen X or millennials talking about this,
Yeah.
they are feeling that pressure. And I will say primarily it's from supervisors who are really in that generation of being a baby boomer. And it's nothing against them. I think it's just the way that they've been, socialized to perceive work. And it's really unfortunate in general because the shift is necessary.
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful to the younger generations for speaking out, because when I tried to do it 10 years ago, no one wanted to listen to me.
Mm-hmm.
And you're absolutely right about how older generations believe that suffering should be a part of the experience. I wrote it down in what I still call my bullying log. My boomer boss said to me, "Progress is painful."
Oh,
And I'm like, no, it's no.
no.
I was like, no, there's something very, very, very wrong with that. I mean, there was a lot that was wrong with him. He was a narcissist. He was emotionally abusive. But that is definitely a boomer mentality, because it took my parents a long time to understand why I had to do this.
Yeah.
And really the only support I had in the very beginning were from my therapist and my husband.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So,
that's really common actually, is that
yeah.
that's where I start to see, and it's funny, you made me think of this, it's a parallel, is
Yeah.
that when I work with, especially my new moms, and they're navigating that postpartum period,
Yeah.
and they're sort of trying to reconcile, what do I go back to work? What does this look like? How do I deal with that boss if I do go back to work? It's funny, there is this parallel process of there's like shame and stigma almost of like acknowledging that you don't like your job, or you like, how do I talk about this? Who do I talk about this with? Just like they'll talk about how I have postpartum anxiety or depression. Who do I talk to about this? It's that similar feeling of stigma around mental health, stigma around, oh, I'm supposed to like my job or be grateful for this job. And I think that is sometimes gender related too, of like, as working women, like, oh, well, you should be so grateful to like have this job or to have been able to work up to this position, even though it's still shifting, and it's shifted significantly from prior generations. There's still so much work to do. And I almost feel like that's part of that, is this sort of this complacency that we're supposed to just digest because, well, you should just be grateful because, not everybody gets to do this. And it's kind of like, what the hell is that? You know what I mean?
Exactly. It's like the devil wears Prada mentality. When I read the book and the movie came out, all those years ago, I still could understand, the refrain of, a million girls would kill for this job, or a million girls would die for this job. And now I look at it and I'm like, what?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh my God. I mean, yeah, it's really amazing how getting older and becoming a parent can really shift your mindset. And I just want to make it clear that you can still have that mindset shift even if you're not a parent.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just like to make sure that people get that.
Yeah.
Even though for me, becoming a parent, it was huge, but you do not need to become a parent for that to happen.
Totally.
Yeah. So do you think there's hope for the traditional workplace? Can we solve these underlying culture problems?
Wow, what a hard question.
Yeah.
I feel like it depends. I mean, I don't think that there's anything wrong with leaving traditional workplace structures. And I think that we will see an evolution in how workplaces are structured. And I don't think it's a bad thing at all. I think there's hope in the sense of people just being able to work together and have systems. I think that systems can change. And that's my orientation as a therapist, right? People exist in systems, family systems, communities, their own internal systems. So there can always be shift. And I think that is what can translate into like that quote unquote traditional workforce of readjusting what's working and what's not. But I don't think that can happen until a cultural shift occurs first around more and more awareness and embracing of what that looks like. And I really think that, going back to even how I left my traditional, 9 to 5 job or school job is the pandemic. And that really helped us recognize that. I think that was a huge impetus of people recognizing, like actually this doesn't work. And honestly, it's so much for the better. So many of the people I get to see during the day, it's because they work from home. They have the flexibility. It's improving their wellness. It's improving their life and their functioning as a human being, whether they have kids or not. It's just, I can do what I need to do to take care of myself. And that's huge. And it's such a paradigm shift because it has been sort of the antithesis to you can't have it all. Like maybe you can't have all of it at the same time, but you can have much more than you used to. And that in and of itself, I think is going to be what is going to drive and sort of be that counter argument to, well, we should go back to the way it was, because there is no going back to the way it was, and we should not go back to the way it was. So I don't think the traditional workplace in the sense of what it was pre-COVID is ever going to come back. I do think that people work in person. People are going to continue to have hierarchies and structures in their systems. But I think that that's going to evolve in what that looks like and the level of collaboration and the HR policies and procedures that are in place, because people are recognizing, hey, this isn't okay, and starting to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so happy to hear that. I mean, I had established that I was going to work from home before COVID hit. But after COVID, I was like, the kind of work that I do, you can never make me come into an office ever again. And I never want to go into an office ever again, because the kind of work that I do, it's not necessary. And also the kind of flexibility that my life demands, it's just not an option. So I don't want to say that I'm grateful for the pandemic, but
Sure.
If there's like one silver lining that came out of it, it's that.
Yeah.
So what are some signs or green flags, if you will, of a healthy working environment? Because we talk so much about red flags, but
Sure.
lately I've been asking, I want to know what people should look for in a healthy working environment. Because like you said earlier, when you go on interviews and not asking and looking into the culture, that was because I didn't know any better. That was a failing on my part.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I didn't even think about that.
It's funny. I actually have a few clients we've talked to, they're interviewing, and we've processed like, what should you ask? And so, some of the things that I will encourage people to ask is, what are things about working here that make you feel good at the end of the day? What are things that, and asking people, if you had to give me a few words to just describe the vibe and culture of working here, what would those adjectives be? So like keeping it simple, just to see what people say on the spot. I also think in terms of green flags, just like when you're there, just noticing how you're handled, noticing what the process has been like in terms of communication in and of itself. And also, not being afraid to do your homework on places too, and get a sense of what they're putting out there as their face value. And that can be hard. It's not a be all end all, but I think that getting a sense of sort of what are the value systems. I have a client now who she's really sick of corporate America. She's totally the counterculture of that. And I completely resonate with her in that sense of, yes, absolutely. And she's really looking at places where they embody her values and her system. So also things like anything from like, what's the climate and culture around, family time, what's the health insurance offer like, and looking into that before you accept an offer, even in terms of like healthcare systems and like, even like, do they cover birth control? Do they cover fertility treatments? What does that look like? And getting a sense of sort of that alignment with your personal values. And that definitely comes in terms of like people's politics, like understanding like what your values are and how that might translate in leadership or not, and where you sit. I think too, just being able to ask yourself, what is my gut telling me? That is so important. People, if you get that ick, if you get that little tingle of like trust your gut, because it's okay to say no. Like, I think that's something important too, is we're so afraid to say, oh, I have to just take this. And it's like, it's actually better to take the right thing than to just take the first thing. I think I learned that too in the beginning of my career. I have had several toxic workplaces, unfortunately.
Me too. I definitely learned that lesson the hard way multiple times.
Yeah. It's hard. And I think but I think that that's what ultimately ends up happening to a lot of people as you go through these experiences. And then you have that wisdom of like, okay, this does not work for me. And so once you've got some of that data, like kind of use it to your advantage. Like if you're picking up on something or that's the sense of the structure, don't go with that. That's okay.
I love that. And I support everything you just said, especially because even today, we are recording this on March 14th, 2024. And I've really learned to trust my gut. And even now, my husband, anytime I'm like, I'm not feeling good about this, he still will always tell me, sleep on it. Well, don't be so, quick to judge. And I was like, no. I think I know how to feel what's right and what's wrong. Mm-hmm. So yeah. So I really appreciate your saying that, because he doesn't always give me the support that I need when I want to trust my gut. And then I think that's just because of his own experiences and because he's been burnt himself. And so I get where he's coming from, but I've had to train myself to not get deterred when he says things like that.
Sure. Yeah. And I think to that point, like what you just noticed is so important of like, yourself. And so trusting your gut and being like, this is what I feel in this moment, I'm going to go with that, is great. And if he's the kind of person that's like, I trust myself, but I want that moment to digest it, that's okay too. Yeah. It's trusting yourself. And I think that's amazing that you recognize that, because, you don't have to be deterred by someone else's way. Like that is so true.
Thank you. But believe me, listeners, I want you to know it took me a long time to get here. And it took me years after leaving Rolling Stone to get to that point. So, and then finally, the question I ask all of my guests, what's one piece of advice you would give someone who's currently in a toxic workplace and, they need to take that first step towards whether it's leaving, making the situation better, or just healing?
I think what I would say is something that I probably wish I had said more strongly to myself when I needed to leave my job, which is, I know that it's so hard right now and you have no idea if this is going to work out. And then the unknown, the uncertainty is the scariest part of this. But no matter how this unfolds, as long as you trust yourself and lean into that uncertainty, doesn't mean you're doomed for failure. It doesn't mean it's going to be bad. Go with what is going to serve you best and trust that you will know. Like, trust the knowing part of you.
Love it. Love it. And how can listeners connect with you?
Sure. So we have an Instagram account that we just post lots of really great resources, content on. If people want to follow us, it's at aworkofheart_counseling. We have a website, aworkofheartcounseling.com, if people are interested and in our area to work with us. Just kind of reaching out that way. But, we're happy to hear from folks if they have questions and want to follow us and get some insight from us.
Wonderful. I will drop links in the show notes. Thank you so much for your insights today. It was great talking to you.
You too.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Kara Kushnir on Emotional Abuse is Real. If you would like to connect with Kara and A Work of Heart Counseling, I've left links to her website and Instagram in the show notes. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out via email at hello@sereneleadsrights.com, through Instagram at sereneleadsrights, or fill out my guest application form. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988. or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, S-T-A-R-T, to 88788. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Instagram, and go grab my free download, 10 Things I Learned from Getting Paid to Watch TV. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.